It is the autumn of 1940, and Britain is losing the war in ways that the public have not yet been told. The streets of London glow orange every night, not from the comfort of electric light, but from the fires that Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe have left behind. St. Paul's Cathedral stands wreathed in smoke on the front pages of the newspapers, its dome miraculous against a sky that should not be that color. In the factories of the Midlands and the North, men and women work shifts of 14 hours. They do not complain. There is no time to complain. But underground, in requisitioned offices and drafty country houses, in the laboratories of universities pressed into wartime service, and in the workshops of men who have spent their careers thinking about very particular problems, a different kind of war is being fought. It is a war of ideas, of physics, of metallurgy and chemistry. It is a war against the clock, against German engineering, against the comfortable assumptions that the great powers of Europe had made about how weapons actually work. And somewhere in this underground world, a man is watching a tram. He is not watching it with the idle curiosity of a commuter. He is watching the way its wheels engage with the rails beneath it. He is watching the angle of contact, the transfer of weight, the way motion becomes directional force with elegant, almost poetic efficiency. He is thinking about bombs. Specifically, he is thinking about a problem that has haunted British bomber crews for years, a problem that has cost lives and missions and precious aircraft, a problem that the finest scientific minds in the country have been unable to crack. And as the tram rounds a corner in the grey autumn light, something shifts in his thinking. What follows is the story of one of the most ingenious and least celebrated weapons of the Second World War. It is the story of the No. 76 Special Incendiary Bomb. A weapon the Germans never saw coming, a weapon that the crews who dropped it barely understood, and a weapon that was born not in a purpose-built laboratory, but in the urgent, improvised, characteristically British spirit of making do. To understand why this bomb mattered, you must first understand the problem it was trying to solve. In the early years of the war, Bomber Command was fighting under constraints that its pre-war planners had never adequately anticipated. The great bombing doctrine that had dominated British strategic thinking throughout the 1930s. The idea that the bomber would always get through, that concentrated raids on industrial and military targets would bring an enemy nation to its knees within weeks, had collided with the brutal reality of European skies and been found wanting. The fundamental problem was accuracy, or rather, the fundamental problem was the almost complete absence of accuracy. By 1940 and into 1941, studies commissioned by the War Cabinet, studies based on actual photographic evidence from returning aircraft, were producing figures that made grown men go quiet. The Butt Report of August 1941, which was the most rigorous analysis undertaken to that point, found that of aircraft recorded as attacking their targets, only roughly 1 in 3 had actually dropped their bombs within 5 miles of the intended point. Over the heavily defended Ruhr, that figure collapsed to 1 in 10, 5 miles. In a country as compact as England, 5 miles is the difference between a factory and a field, between a railway marshalling yard and a village church, between strategic effect and no effect at all. The existing bombs were part of the problem, but only part. The general-purpose bombs that filled the bellies of Wellingtons and Hamptons and Stirlings were designed for a world in which aeroplanes flew at the speeds and altitudes of the late 1920s. At the heights being flown in 1940 and 1941, their ballistic characteristics were unpredictable. They tumbled, they drifted, and when they did hit something, their blast effect, while dramatic, was often less catastrophic to reinforced industrial structures than the bomb designers had hoped. The incendiary bomb, meanwhile, had its own problems. The standard small incendiary, a slim magnesium-cased stick roughly the size of a rolling pin, was effective enough when it landed in the right place. But dropping thousands of small incendiaries from altitude meant scattering them across a wide area with little control over where the individual fires might start. And starting fires was only half the problem. The other half was keeping them burning long enough to cause serious structural damage before the enemy's fire services could respond. What Bomber Command needed was a weapon that combined the fire-starting capacity of an incendiary with the destructive weight of a general-purpose bomb. It needed something large enough to punch through a factory roof, hot enough to set industrial materials alight, and persistent enough to defeat the efforts of fire wardens. It needed, in other words, something that did not yet exist. The man who solved the problem, or at least the man most directly associated with the weapon that emerged from the attempt to solve it, was working within the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a department whose deliberately vague name concealed work of genuine significance. The DMWD, as it was known to those within it, was one of several organizations created specifically to handle the sort of problem that fell between the established categories of weapons research. It was, by the standards of British bureaucracy, deliberately unorthodox. The core technical challenge was this: how do you create a large incendiary device, something weighing in the region of 14 kilograms, roughly 30 pounds, that behaves predictably when dropped from altitude, that ignites reliably on contact with a variety of surfaces, and that burns with sufficient intensity and duration to defeat firefighting efforts? The answer, as it turned out, lay in a liquid. The substance at the heart of the No. 76 Special Incendiary was a mixture based primarily on white phosphorus, one of the most extraordinary and terrifying compounds in the chemist's arsenal. White phosphorus ignites spontaneously when exposed to air. It burns at temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius. It produces a thick, white, choking smoke as it does so. It cannot be extinguished with water. Indeed, water can make it worse, scattering burning fragments across a wider area. And crucially for the purposes of a weapon, it continues burning as long as it has fuel and access to oxygen. The mixture developed for the No. 76 also included benzene and water in carefully calibrated proportions, creating a compound that was stable enough to be stored and transported, but violently reactive when the conditions changed. The bomb casing itself was thin, deliberately so. Unlike a general-purpose bomb, which relied on a robust steel body to contain its explosive charge until detonation, the No. 76 was designed to shatter on impact, releasing its contents as a spray across the widest possible area. The thin glass or pressed steel casing, different variants were used at different stages of the weapon's development, would break open and the phosphorus mixture would ignite instantly upon contact with the air. The bomb was roughly 45 centimeters in length, perhaps 18 centimeters in diameter, and contained approximately 2.3 kilograms of the phosphorus mixture alongside other combustible materials. When dropped from operational altitude, typically somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 feet in bomber command operations of this period, it fell with a relatively predictable trajectory. And here is where the Tram comes back into the story. The stabilization of the weapon during its fall, the prevention of the tumbling and drifting that had plagued earlier designs, was achieved partly through fin arrangements that owed something to the observation of how flanged wheels interact with the track. The principle, expressed in its simplest form, is that a rotating or channeled surface can be used to impart directional stability to an object in motion. Applied to the tail fins of the number 76, a variant of this thinking produced a more predictable ballistic path. The bomb did not simply fall, it fell correctly. Production of the number 76 was undertaken at several locations across Britain, with facilities dispersed as a precaution against enemy bombing. Exact production figures remain partly obscured by wartime classification that was never fully lifted, but estimates drawn from operational records suggest that tens of thousands of weapons were manufactured between 1941 and 1944. The production process was not straightforward. Handling white phosphorus at scale requires extraordinary precautions, and there were incidents during manufacture that were quietly removed from official records. The number 76 entered operational use with Bomber Command in 1941, and accounts from aircrew who handled it describe a weapon that inspired a particular kind of respect, bordering on unease. The bombs were transported in sealed metal containers, packed in water to prevent any premature contact with air. Ground crews loaded them carefully, methodically, in a manner quite different from the more cavalier handling that general-purpose bombs sometimes received. Everyone who worked with them knew what would happen if a casing cracked prematurely, and nobody wished to find out from personal experience. In the air, the number 76 was typically deployed as part of a mixed load, a combination of general-purpose bombs to breach structures and scatter firefighting personnel, followed by incendiaries to start and spread fires. The number 76, with its relatively large size and intense burning characteristics, was aimed at the sort of target where sustained heat was the primary requirement. Warehouses, fuel stores, timber yards, the wooden roofing structures of older industrial buildings. Specific records of individual drops are fragmentary, as is common with weapons of this type. What survives in squadron operational record books and debriefing reports is a picture of a weapon that performed better than many aircrew expected. The fires it started were described as persistent and resistant to suppression in the sort of understated language that characterizes British operational reporting. German fire service records from the Ruhr, captured after the war, noted with evident frustration the presence of a British incendiary compound that their standard suppression methods, sand, foam, controlled flooding, struggled to manage effectively. The psychological dimension is harder to quantify. What is certain is that any weapon which produces spontaneous, unquenchable fire carries a particular weight in the imagination of those on the receiving end. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It keeps this kind of detailed history alive and allows us to keep making it. It is instructive to set the number 76 alongside what Germany was developing in the same period, because the comparison reveals something interesting about the different approaches taken by the two sides. German incendiary doctrine in the early years of the war relied heavily on the 1 kilogram electron bomb, a small mass-produced device that could be dropped in enormous quantities. The brand bomb, 1 kilogram as it was formally designated, was designed for saturation. Drop enough of them, and statistical probability ensures that some will land in places that matter. The weapon was effective. The fires of the London Blitz demonstrated that with terrible clarity, but it lacked the capacity for focused, deep penetration of hardened industrial structures. The Germans also experimented with oil bomb variants and with larger incendiary weapons, but their development of a phosphorus-based device comparable to the number 76 lagged considerably. This was not for want of chemistry knowledge. German chemical science was, in many respects, more advanced than Britain's at the start of the war. The lag appears to have been a consequence of prioritization. German strategic bombing doctrine in the early war period leaned towards the tactical support of ground operations rather than the strategic bombardment of industrial infrastructure, and the weapons development program reflected that emphasis. The Americans, when they arrived in the European theater, brought their own incendiary philosophy with them, one that tended towards the thermite-based M47, and later the napalm compounds that would achieve their most horrifying expression in the Pacific Campaign. American doctrine favored mass and intensity over the targeted persistence that the number 76 was designed to achieve. Both approaches had their merits, and both had their advocates, and the arguments between Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force about the correct application of air power were conducted with a passion that sometimes seemed disproportionate to external observers. What the number 76 offered that most of its contemporaries could not match was the combination of guaranteed ignition, sustained burning, and resistance to suppression. A thermite bomb burns hotter, briefly. A small magnesium incendiary covers more area per bomb load. But for a crew tasked with putting a specific building beyond use for a sustained period, the number 76 had few rivals. The historical impact of the number 76 Special Incendiary is genuinely difficult to assess with precision, and honesty requires acknowledging that difficulty rather than papering over it. The broader question of whether the strategic bombing campaign achieved its stated objectives remains one of the most contested areas of Second World War historiography. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after the war, concluded that the bombing campaign had caused significant disruption, but had often failed to achieve the decisive results that its proponents had predicted. German industrial production, famously, actually increased in some sectors through 1944, even as the bombing intensified, a fact that was deeply uncomfortable for those who had staked careers and doctrine on the promise of strategic air power. Within that complicated broader picture, the number 76's contribution is necessarily modest. It was one weapon among many, deployed in one campaign among several, within a strategic framework that was itself still being argued over at the highest levels of government. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that it performed its intended function. The fires it started burned. The structures it targeted were damaged. The fire services that tried to put it out often found that they could not. The legacy that matters most may not be operational at all. The number 76 demonstrated something about the nature of weapons development that has remained true ever since, that the solutions to apparently intractable problems sometimes emerge from lateral thinking, from the observation of unrelated phenomena, from the willingness to look at a tram and see a bomb. The formal processes of weapons procurement, The committees, the specifications, the tender processes are necessary and important, but they are not sufficient. The history of British military innovation in the Second World War is littered with examples of weapons and technologies that emerged from precisely this kind of unofficial, oblique, improvisational thinking. For those wishing to examine physical evidence, a small number of number 76 variants exist in museum collections, principally at the RAF Museum in Hendon, where they are displayed alongside the aircraft that carried them. Seeing one in person is a curiously intimate experience. The weapon is smaller than you expect, not much larger than a domestic fire extinguisher, and its construction has the slightly improvised quality of something that was designed in a hurry by people who knew exactly what they needed and were not willing to wait for perfection. Return for a moment to that autumn afternoon in 1940. The tram moves through the grey streets. The man watching it is tired. Everyone is tired in that autumn, in that particular way that comes from months of emergency thinking, of problems that resist solution, of news that keeps arriving from the direction you least want it to come from. The German army stands on the Channel coast. The Luftwaffe fills the sky at night. The invasion barges are counted and recounted by reconnaissance aircraft flying low and fast over the French harbors. And yet, this man is watching a tram. There is something characteristically British about that. Not the watching of trams particularly, but the refusal to be entirely consumed by emergency. The persistence of curiosity even under pressure. The habit of mind that finds it impossible to observe a wheel engaging with a rail without wondering, even briefly, whether there is something to be learned from the elegance of the mechanism. What emerged from that observation was a weapon that the Germans could not extinguish, that the fire wardens could not smother, that the chemistry of the period could not easily defeat. It was not the war-winning weapon that some of its advocates hoped it might become. Very few weapons are. But it was a weapon that worked, that did what it was designed to do, that was produced in numbers sufficient to matter, and that found its way into the bomb bays of aircraft crewed by young men who flew into darkness every night and did not always come back. To make something that works, in the circumstances of 1940 and 1941, in a country that was fighting alone and losing on every visible metric, was no small achievement. To make something that works because a man watched a tram, that is the kind of history that deserves to be told. The number 76 Special Incendiary Bomb was never famous. It was never the subject of a Hollywood film or a triumphant government announcement. It appeared in operational record books under its designation number and was delivered to its targets by men who knew its capabilities but rarely its origins. It was a secret weapon in the most complete sense, secret from the enemy, and secret even from many of those who built it, carried it, and dropped it into the burning dark. But somewhere in the archive, in the requisitioned country houses, and the quiet laboratories, and the drafty workshops where Britain's secret war was won, one improvised idea at a time, the tram still turns its corner, the wheel still meets the rail, and the bomb still falls correctly toward the fires below. That is what Britain made in its darkest year. That is what Britain was.